Making buttons within Bootstrap framework is incredibly easy. So back to our code here, we're going to go ahead and add a button below the image. So to create any button, you're just going to simply use a button tag. And then you're going to give your button tag a class of BTN, which is short for button. It's also important to give the button a type. Ours is just going to be button, so you can see under here button, reset, or submit. So you want to, for accessibility purposes, make sure that the type of button that you're creating matches the button that you're creating. So if it's a submit button, it should say that under type. Go ahead and save that. And there is my basic button without any color. So if I want to add some of the contextual colors to this, I can go ahead and add that to the classes. So under BTN, I'm going to add BTN primary. And that will give me that nice, lovely blue button. So I can add the secondary, success, info, warning, danger, dark, light, or link into those. And any of those contextual classes will change what the color is of that button. So that is your basic button within Bootstrap. You can also make that outlined as opposed to being a solid fill color. This also works with those contextual colors, so you would just add the word outline into that class. So BTN outline secondary. And that will give your button an outline color. You can change the sizes of your buttons by adding some sizing to them as well. So you have, by default, this is the default size, but you can also make them large or small. So I'm going to go ahead and keep this one as my default button. I'm going to copy this entire button here, and I'll paste one above here to make this one a button large. So BTN LG will make a large button. There you can see, let's call this large instead of default. Here's my large button, there's my default button size, and let's go ahead and make a small button so you can see the three next to each other. So add the class of BTN SM for small. We'll call this a small button. So there's our large, default size, and small button sizes. You can create a button that spans the full width of the parent element, so whatever container that is in, by giving it a class of BTN block. I'm going to go ahead and create a new button here. And I'm going to give that a class of BTN block. So right now, my block line button is kind of sitting in line with the rest of its items in its parent group, so it's not responding to the full width of this container. So what I'm going to do to kind of pop it out so it's not responding to everything else around it is I'm going to go ahead and put it into its own row. So I'm going to create a new div with a class of row. And I'm going to wrap that around my block level button. I'm going to save that, and there that popped out to being this now block level button that's now lining up with the width of this entire container. So whenever you're creating these buttons, you want to make sure that what it is responding to is where you want it to go. So if you're having difficulty, it may be being held within the container with everything else, so you may have to pop it into its own row or its own container to get it to go full width of the column that you need it to go. Other things we can add to our buttons is we can turn them into active buttons or disable them. So if I would like to I'm going to go ahead and take out the outline on this one so it's a little bit more visible. So right now it says dark gray. I can disable this button just by giving it a class of disabled. And I'll save that, and now I can no longer click that button because it is disabled. I can also make it an active button by giving it the class of active. So that now becomes the button that it takes away that hover color. It is now an active button. You can add spinners to your buttons. There's quite a few different spinner classes within Bootstrap, so you can always look up all of the ones on W3 Schools. But simply to put a class of spinner onto my button. So to put this spinner on here, I'm going to go ahead and work within the button tag itself. So I need to open up that button tag, and I'm going to create a span class, or a span tag, span tag with a class of spinner border. Go ahead and close that, and then I'm going to change this to just read loading button. And then you can see there is my spinner on there. You can change the sizes of your spinner. So if I want to make this small, since this is a small button, I can make it spinner border small. Save that. And now that's a little bit more appropriate for the size of the spinner itself. So you can add any of those spinner classes to any of these buttons if you're wanting to add any of that interaction to the buttons themselves. You can group buttons together, so if you had a group of like item buttons, you can put them together in a button group. So as opposed to having kind of this default spacing around them, you will get them so they kind of cram together into one group. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Alright, I'm going to make all my buttons the same size just so they kind of make a little bit more sense. I'm going to take the outline off of them as well. So there's my 3 buttons that I'm going to go ahead and put into a group. So right now they're just individually tagged. So I'm going to wrap a div tag around them that has a class of btn group. So I'm going to create my div tag, give it a class of btn for button group. Mark this or comment out, end of button group. And then I'm going to go ahead and cut this and wrap it around these buttons. So now you can see this is the beginning of my button group wrapped around these 3 buttons. I'm going to go ahead and save that. And now you can see that these have, instead of that spacing in between, they're still individual buttons, but they're now grouped together as a proper grouping of buttons. So this would be something that you would do if you had like items grouped together in like items, say if you were doing categories or something like that. You can also do a vertical button group. So all you have to do to that is btn group vertical. And that will make a vertical group of buttons. So you can nest some of your button groups into drop-down menus. So what that looks, so if you wanted to do something that's nested into a drop-down, it's going to be a little bit more complicated, but we're going to put in a new drop-down menu item. To create a nested drop-down for your button group, we're going to go ahead and work within this button group here. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back into a horizontal one. It will work on a vertical one as well. But so I'm going to create a nested div inside of this button group div. to apply to this last button to make it my drop down. So after my second button here, I'm going to go ahead and open up and create a new div with a class of drop down menu. So within that drop down menu, I'm going to go ahead and create some drop down items. So I'm going to create an A tag with a class of drop down item. Give it a link, placeholder link, item 1. I'm going to duplicate that. I'm going to have one for item 2. So there's my drop down menu. And now I need to create the button group for that drop down menu to go into. So again, after this second button, I'm going to go ahead and create a new div with a class of btn group. And I'm going to paste in my button and my drop down items. Paste those in here. And I'm actually going to move my button up above my drop down menu items. So cut that button group. Here's my button. Call this a drop down button. And then there's my menu items. So I need to change this button as well. So it is still a type of button, but I need to give it the, within the class, I can leave it as a secondary button as I already have it, but I need to add in that drop down toggle. So that way that this knows to do a drop down on it, and then I need to add a data toggle of drop down. So that's a lot of pieces and parts, so let's break that down just a little bit. So I have my outer button group here. That's those 3 button items. I have a standard button, 2 standard buttons here. Then I have a nested button group within this outer button group. And then I have my button that has the drop down, so drop down toggle with the drop down. I'm going to get rid of this little spinner just because it's distracting a little bit. I don't need it anymore. So this will now say drop down button. And then underneath that, I will have my drop down menu with these 2 items. I'm going to go ahead and save that. So in the middle of recording this, I found an update that Bootstrap has made that was kind of lost in the documentation. So from an older Bootstrap 4 version to the new Bootstrap, I guess we're moving into 5 beta, and that would be that you need to change it not data toggle, but data-bs for Bootstrap-toggle in order to get this to drop down. So then if I jump in here, now this is going to drop down, and then you'll see that. So that is a way to get a button group to turn into a toggling drop-down menu.